Missouri. Chapter 4. On the River Road. Daniel Boone liked what he had heard about Missouri, so in spite of his arthritis, he chopped down an enormous tulip poplar tree that had been growing for years by the Big Sandy River in far eastern Kentucky. Then he spent the last spring and summer of the 1700s turning it into a canoe. 60 feet long, it was plenty roomy enough to take his family down the Ohio River, away from Kentucky forever. He'd had it. Sturdy, steadfast Rebecca went with him and their daughters and their children. Daniel Morgan helped his uncle, 54-year-old squire, pilot the Boone's canoe, loaded down with family and their belongings. Friends and relatives in flatboats and arks joined the flotilla or walked along overland with Daniel and his sons-in-law and the cattle and a string of pack horses. Except for young Nathan, who delayed his journey to get married, they set off in September 1799. Folks along the way gathered to say so long, or to be able to say they saw old Boone himself, or to pump Daniel's calloused hand and wish him well. Why, they'd ask, was he leaving Kentucky? Too many people, was the reply he gave to a bunch of Cincinnatians. Too crowded, Daniel sang out. Too crowded. I want more elbow room. On the river. Over and around rapids, snags, rocks, past landings, bluffs, and river towns, the pioneers adventured on to the violent meeting of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Lots of folk would hang a left here and head down to New Orleans, but not Daniel. He and his companions were bound for St. Louis, 200 miles upstream. That meant forcing their way against tons of muddy water on its 4-mile-per-hour way to the Gulf of Mexico. Folks sailed, paddled, rowed, poled, and even hiked along the banks and towed their boats up the Mississippi. Trekking or floating, the Boones and their friends would have seen all kinds of keelboats, dugouts, loaded flatboats and barges, river equivalents of freight-hauling trucks on today's highways. At night, lanterns from rafts and boats reflected on the black, shimmering face of the river. Mornings revealed herons, songbirds, wood ducks, and mallards, bright, long-necked egrets, and red-winged blackbirds. They all shared the Father of Waters with everything from ridgeback snapping turtles to long-whiskered catfish. Travelers on the great river would have glimpsed man-made hills, old and silent on its banks. For worship, burials, and for reasons only they knew, Native Americans had built mounds and earthworks clear back in prehistoric times. Crackling trade and village life was going on 600 years before Daniel's time. Now, most of Missouri's native folks were tall, copper-skinned Osage Indians, as well as Little Osage and Missouri tribes, Sauk and Delaware people too. In fact, Daniel would meet old Shawnee acquaintances in the years to come, folks who remembered him as Sheltowee. If Daniel and the others ferried or paddled to the Stee, Genevieve Landing, they'd be at Missouri's first permanent town, founded by French settlers in the 1730s when Daniel was a baby. They farmed, made salt, and mined lead there on the eastern edge of Louisiana Territory, long claimed by France. It was under Spanish control these days, but next year, 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte, France's very ambitious young ruler, would make the King of Spain give it back. In any event, the Boone caravan arrived at St. Louis, begun 35 years earlier by French fur traders, in October 1799. Zenon Trudeau, the ex-lieutenant governor of Spanish Louisiana, and the new man on the job, Carlos de Laces, were there to greet them. Above their heads, the Spanish flag fluttered beside America's stars and stripes. Drummers drummed and riflemen fired salutes, all in honor of amazed, pleased, travel-weary Daniel Boone. He'd been invited, you see. What's more, Trudeau had offered Daniel's fellow travelers a bunch of Missouri land. For Daniel, there was a swath of land and a civil service job. More about that later. As to Boone's land grants, care was taken to make sure that all was in order. Daniel made sure he'd saved the paperwork. He didn't want any more real estate problems. Daniel and Rebecca settled in at the house of their son, Daniel Morgan, about 60 miles west of where the Missouri River empties into the Mississippi. Then the Boone men went deer hunting. Later, in the deep end of the winter, 65-year-old Daniel and 61-year-old Rebecca went off into the woods, just the two of them, set up a camp, and made maple sugar. It was February 1800. The curtain was coming down on the 18th century, and on old Daniel's wanderings, not by a long shot. 1800. Probably Daniel and his dogs were out hunting when 30-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte was grabbing control of France's government way off over in Paris. Closer to home, all sorts of laborers were at work on a big stone house in the federal city between Maryland and Virginia. They'd built it on a site particularly chosen by President No. 1, George Washington, back in 1792. He'd died a few weeks after Daniel arrived in Missouri. President No. 2, John Adams, would be moving into the still unfinished house later in the year. We'd have to clear out a few months later to make way for President No. 3, Thomas Jefferson. The U.S. population was up to 5,300,000, of which 1 million were Africans, mostly enslaved. Slavery was a nasty part of America's economy and way of life. Daniel Boone was a part of that world. He owned a few servants now and then, when he could afford them. In the summer of 1800, Daniel took up his new job. As syndic of the vast Femme Osage district northwest of the Missouri-Mississippi River Junction, Daniel had a combination of duties: public affairs administrator, sheriff, military commander. And he was a good judge. Folks brought their troubles to Daniel's judgment tree, an enormous elm near Senor Boone's house. Beneath its branches, he'd listen, then pronounce his decision by authority of the Spanish crown. Even as Louisiana Territory passed from Spanish to French, then to American control, Daniel stayed on the job. News traveled slowly. Besides, whether it was a stolen horse, 39 lashes at the whipping post for the culprit, or the murder of his own son-in-law, Susanna's hot-headed husband, a case of self-defense, most folks knew they'd find justice under Daniel's tree. He settled land disputes, too. Heaven knows he'd had lots of experience with those. But it didn't help, not when American officials showed up in the Femme Osage, a U.S. territory, as of December 1803, with some official questions. Yes, Daniel had the lieutenant governor's signature on his Spanish land grants, but not that of the governor down in New Orleans. So he hadn't put in any crops on his land. The old pioneer stood tall in his buckskin and homespun. No, he told the commissioners, he didn't actually live on the land he'd been granted. He and his wife lived with their son, Daniel Morgan. Well, the officials were real sad about it, but according to the law, Daniel couldn't keep his land. It could have been worse. Others of the Boone clan still owned a considerable bit of Missouri property, but this loss on top of all that he'd lost in Kentucky was pretty upsetting. Champions petitioned the U.S. government on his behalf, until finally, in 1814, he was offered 850 acres of public land. Daniel's pride was stung at such a piddling portion of a continent he'd worked and suffered so much to settle. He wasn't some beggar asking for a handout. As soon as Kentuckians saw in the newspapers that old Boone had some property, they hightailed it to Missouri and made him sell it to pay off old debts. Harsh. Wide Mouth and the Birdman. Ah, well, except for when his arthritis pained his old bones too much, or when he was nursing his hurt hand, hard bitten by a beaver trap, restless Daniel still hunted for game and countrysides yet unseen. On one of his westerly gallivants along the Missouri River, he discovered a salty spring. He and his sons turned it into a prosperous salt-boiling business. Soon, keelboats full of salt were on their way to St. Louis and beyond. The trail from Boone's Lick soon became a major east-west route along frontier Missouri. Like almost every other early American byway, it was awful. If the mud does not quite get over your boot tops when you sit in the saddle, one traveler griped, they call it a middling good road. Daniel paddled west up the muddy, shape-shifting Missouri River, then on upstream to who knows how far north, clear up to the Dakotas, some have said. On one trip and another, he nosed his log canoe into who knows how many of the Missouri's tributaries to see where they'd go. The Platte River led him out into Nebraska, into the foothills of the Rockies. He followed the Grand River up into Iowa, where one winter day he saw signs of Indians, hunters who wouldn't want an intruder hanging around with a string of beaver traps. It wouldn't do for them to see his prints in the snow, so he covered his stuck-in-the-ice canoe and burrowed into a snow-camouflaged cave. Bundled in buckskin and furs, cooking his venison by night when the smoke wouldn't be seen, old Widemouth camped undetected 20 days and 20 nights. When the weather warmed, off he went with his bundle of pelts safely down the stream. Louisiana, Lewis and Clark. After French explorer Sieur de La Salle and his men canoed down the Mississippi in 1682, he claimed all the land drained by the river for his country. He named the territory after Louis the Ninth. Neither his king, the 19th, Louis the 19th. Neither this king nor the next could see how vast, wild Louisiana could make France any richer. So in 1762, Louis gave the western half of it to the King of Spain. In 1763, Great Britain won the other half in the French and Indian War. In time, all sorts of people were shipping goods on the Mississippi, an increasingly important water highway. Boatloads of goods were moving in and out of the international seaport at the river's mouth. It wasn't long, 1784, before officials were closed the lower Mississippi to the newly independent Americans. So many of them meant too much competition. After France's revolution in the 1790s, and after its new leader, Napoleon, reclaimed Louisiana, President Thomas Jefferson decided to try to buy U.S. right-of-way through New Orleans. For his part, Napoleon needed money to go to war against Great Britain, France's old enemy. So he made an offer that Jefferson could not refuse. The whole territory, 827,987 square miles. The price? $15 million. When the U.S. took possession of the Louisiana Purchase on December 20th, 1803, plans to explore the land were already in the works. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and their team would pull out of St. Louis on May 14th, 1804, and not return from their truly heroic expedition until September 23rd, 1806. So, did Daniel journey back east? Possibly. He'd never wanted to have anything more to do with Kentucky, but when he heard in 1796 that Kentucky's first governor was planning to widen and improve the Wilderness Road, Daniel did offer his services. "I think myself as capable of marking and cutting that road as any other man," he wrote, but got no answer from Governor Shelby. In 1810, Daniel went to visit his brother Squire, who'd gone to live in Indiana. Daniel was hunting in the rocky woodlands of the Kentucky River when, as John James Audubon later told the story, the old pioneer and Audubon made each other's acquaintance. Off in his unknowable future, Audubon's famously realistic Birds of America would be the publishing sensation of 1826. He would eventually create a portrait of Daniel Boone, but Audubon was equally good at painting word pictures. Daniel was a stout, hale, and athletic man dressed in a homespun hunting shirt, bare-legged and moccasined, and someone who knew how to bark a squirrel for supper. Daniel lifted his long, heavy rifle, took slow aim, and bang! The sound of the shot cracked like a whip, echoing through the woods. Exactly where the rifle ball hit beneath the squirrel's perch, the bark shivered into splinters, and the concussion killed the squirrel and sent it whirling through the air. What delightful sport this was, barking a squirrel. And two, no annoying, tooth-cracking, fur-mussing rifle balls in one's supper or the furry little pelt. 2 years later, Daniel was still as sure a shot and spry as ever, and he saw no reason why he shouldn't be allowed to fight when his country needed soldiers. After all, Missouri was an official U.S. territory, and the U.S. was officially moving into the War of 1812. Mr. Madison's War. It was a complicated deal, having mostly to do with the freedom of the seas, which were all too lively in the first decade of the 19th century, thanks to fighting between Great Britain and France. For about the past 20 years, they'd been at war, whether in battles or blockades, choking off your enemy's harbors. Their favorite weapons were ships, and America kept getting caught in the middle. Worse, Britain had a nasty habit of stopping American ships and forcing U.S. sailors into the King's Navy. The U.S. puny infant republic that it was fought back by not buying British goods and by closing their ports to foreign ships, but that mostly hurt U.S. business. Finally, in the summer of 1812, President number 4, James Madison, declared war against Great Britain. His enemies called the War of 1812 Mr. Madison's War. Whatever it was called, it was as much about land as it ever was about freedom of the seas. Some Americans wanted to go after Great Britain again because the British up in Canada still supported tribes that lived around the Great Lakes. Those Indians were holding on to what settlers wanted, more land. And indeed, as the War of 1812 got going, it was an Indian war in the frontier settlements. Both Nathan and Daniel Morgan Boone saw action, and their nephew, James Calloway, was killed in a battle. Old Daniel came running to more than one neighbor's rescue when raiders were on the attack. More than once, folks hurried to ford up for fear of Indians armed with knives, guns, and tomahawks. One day, trouble rumors spurred Jemima's husband, Flanders Calloway, to flee. He grabbed important possessions, plus a sheaf of papers that his father-in-law had been working on, and headed down the river. Flanders barely escaped drowning when his canoe capsized, but Daniel Boone's autobiography wasn't so lucky. A nephew of Rebecca published his own version of Daniel's life story in poetry form in 1813. Daniel was not impressed. Saddest of all for Daniel was a loss that had nothing to do with fighting in war. His wife, 74-year-old Rebecca, took sick and died on March 18th, 1813. Long before he was planted in his grave, Daniel Boone paid a carpenter to make him a fine walnut burial box. As time passed, one of his neighbors passed away. Daniel donated his coffin as a parting gift to his friend and ordered himself a new box, this one made from a cherry tree. He kept the coffin in his cabin and stretched out in it from time to time to get the feel of it. There'd come a time when Americans would smile at engravings of a drawing of famous Colonel Boone, handsomely uniformed, testing out his coffin. He didn't actually get buried in it until 7 years after Rebecca passed away. In the meantime, white-haired Daniel kept company with his children and grandchildren and kept on exploring. One fellow noted that old Daniel couldn't live without being in the woods. He goes a-hunting twice a year in the remotest wilderness he can reach. On one of his westerly gallimants, Daniel stopped at Fort Osage. Its log walls crowned a high bluff over the Missouri River, a bit east of the yet-to-be-founded town of Independence. You can imagine frowns, then amazement, on the faces of the folks there, realizing that the rough, sorry-looking backcountry hunter at their door was the famous Colonel Boone. He visited with the fur trappers and soldiers there. The War of 1812 had been settled at the end of 1814. The military presence at the Missouri River fort had to do with the Osage tribes thereabouts. They could be contrary at times, in the opinion of settlers such as Daniel Boone. He'd had some tense encounters, such as when he and a grandson had to run for their lives from some Osage fellows who'd meant them no good. In 1819, when he was 84, Daniel made one last trip to Kentucky. He put up with folks making a fuss over him, tracked down everybody to whom he owed any money, and paid them all. He didn't want anyone ever to be able to say, after he was gone, that Boone was a dishonest man. Back in Missouri, he made himself at home in one or another of his children's houses. At supper time, he'd hoped there'd be sweet potatoes, his favorite. If asked, he'd tell stories while he toasted his feet by the fire, while maybe a granddaughter played beauty parlor, putting her grandpa's long white hair in a braid. It's said that a boy from over at Boone's Lick came to listen to Daniel's frontier tales and be inspired. Kit Carson would be a famous scout and trapper himself, a soldier too, in the Indian wars out west. The idea of exploring farther into the west appealed to Daniel, but his eyes and ears weren't so keen anymore. He had to use a cane to get around. When he peered at the portrait that visiting painter Chester Harding had done of him, Daniel saw an old, old man. In the fall of 1820, 85-year-old Daniel rode his horse to Nathan's house. It was and still is a handsome stone house. Daniel helped his son build it. He fell ill and died there early in the morning of September 26. Daniel, in his cherry wood coffin, was buried next to Rebecca. Then what? If you thought that Daniel and Rebecca Boone were still resting in peace near the Missouri River, you would perhaps be wrong. In 1845, Missourians were talked into letting the Boones be dug up so they might be buried in Kentucky's state capital. There was a grand ceremony, speeches, and a parade. Daniel and Rebecca probably got a bang out of it up in the blue beyond in the happy hunting grounds. But are their bones crumbling beneath the fine monument in Frankfort, Kentucky? Some say that Daniel's descendants wanted to keep what was left of him in Missouri, so they pointed to the wrong grave, and Rebecca's remains were taken, but not Daniel's. During the Civil War, Union soldiers went through the Cumberland Gap to invaded Tennessee in 1862 and 1863. During Daniel's lifetime, the Wilderness Road was widened to allow for big Conestoga wagons. Later, it was paved and had its steep and curvy sections blasted with dynamite to make it safer for automobiles. Though much of the Wilderness Road has vanished beneath farms and buildings, stretches of Daniel's old trail lie beneath modern highways such as U.S. Route 25. Since 1996, motorists have been able to drive up from Tennessee to Kentucky by way of the Cumberland Gap Tunnel, 4,600 feet long. Adventurous, self-reliant Daniel Boone continued to be a role model long after his lifetime. Before the Boy Scouts of America came into being in 1910, there was the Society of the Sons of Daniel Boone, formed 5 years earlier by author-illustrator Daniel Beard. When future U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt formed the nation's first conservation organization in 1887, he named the Boone and Crockett Club after two of his heroes, Daniel Boone and a colorful politician from Tennessee, Davy Crockett, who was said to have been killed in 1836 at the Battle of Alamo in San Antonio, Texas. Daniel and Davy. These two frontier legends were linked together in the middle of the 20th century. Each got a fresh shot of fame when a weekly Daniel Boone television show began airing on NBC every Thursday night, 1964 to 1970. Fess Parker, the actor who portrayed Daniel, wore a swell raccoon-skin cap, as he had when he played Davy Crockett on TV in 1954 and 55. This led to some confusion between the two very different men and to thousands of little kids running around with coon-skin caps on their heads, something the real Daniel Boone never did. After all, coonskin caps don't come equipped with brims to keep out the rain. Chapter 5. On the Go. From Here to There. In his long life, Daniel followed paths made by wayfarers who had passed that way perhaps thousands of years before. People have always needed roads, especially after some smarty pants invented the wheel 5,500 years ago, give or take a century or two. The first road signs were a pile of stones here, a notched tree there. One of the first toll roads, where you have to pay, ran between Syria and Babylon in the land now known as Iraq in 2000 BC. Laborers in the ancient Roman Empire built the first really great roads, curved so water could drain off and paved with flat stones, cut and fitted. Folks still travel on some of them. Taking to the road was an adventure for early Americans. One lady, Madam Knight, described her 1704 travels in Connecticut. The roads all along this way are very bad, encumbered with rocks and mountainous passages, which were very disagreeable to my tired carcass. People came up with all sorts of paving solutions for their muddy, stump-studded, rutted roads. Bricks, cobblestones, wooden blocks or planks, or corduroy, which was split logs laid side by side, not only bumpy, but horrid footing for poor horses and oxen. In 1795, Americans used broken rocks and gravel for their first paved turnpike, a toll taker open to turnstile to let you pass through, a 62-mile-long road between the Pennsylvania towns of Lancaster and Philadelphia. In the early 1800s, John McAdam, a Scotsman, came up with the idea of surfacing roads with pressed rocks, evenly sized. Others improved on this McAdam surface by adding coal tar or asphalt to make blacktop roads. The first way the Daniel Boone moved about was in the arms of someone older. Then, being an able-bodied human baby, he crawled, then pulled himself up and walked. As colonial folks might say, he traveled by shank's mare, which meant his legs were his horse. On foot was the main way of getting around in 18th century America. When Daniel Boone left Kentucky in 1799, he walked the 700 or so miles to Missouri. If the path and the weather weren't too totally muddy, icy, or rainy, a person could walk 40 miles in a 10-hour day. In the wintertime, he or she might strap on snowshoes as the Indians did. A good walker would be leaning forward a bit into the motion, making long strides, sometimes waving at a horse rider or passenger in an ox cart or stagecoach. Some folks herded animals along the road or trampled along with supplies on their backs held by tumplines, broad straps, strapped around their foreheads. Toward the end of a day's journey, these colonial wanderers would be asking about an inn or maybe an ordinary bed and breakfast in a local widow's home. They'd hope for a good meal, that the bed wouldn't be too wretched, and that they wouldn't have to share it with too many bedbugs, fleas, or other people, all of which were customary. A horse traveler wasn't as common in colonial times as you might think. It cost a lot of money to feed and shelter an animal, much less equip it with saddle and bridle. As for carriages, only very rich people owned one of those. It'd be like having your own personal limo. Loads of craftspeople were employed keeping folks on the move. Blacksmiths, wheelwrights, harness makers, and builders of everything from pony carts to Conestoga wagons. You may not think of air travel as being something that people did in Daniel Boone's time, but they did, sort of. Right about the time Daniel and Rebecca were opening their tavern by the Ohio River, where flatboats full of settlers were getting regularly attacked by native warriors, Benjamin Franklin and a crowd of Frenchmen were out watching what Ben called a philosophical experiment, the first manned flight of a lighter-than-air balloon in 1783. About 80 feet in the air over Paris, Pilatre de Rosière was in a basket dangling from one of the Montgolfier brothers' silk and paper contraptions. Not quite 10 years later, when Daniel was 59, cannon boomed a salute, then varnished yellow silk balloon full of hydrogen sailed above Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The man taking the Western Hemisphere's first trip in the clouds was Jean-Pierre Blanchard. Very likely, he waved his white plumed hat at the crowd below. The 60-year-old president of the infant United States of America was a very dignified person, but I'll bet George Washington waved back. The long roads. When Daniel Boone was 70 years old, a steam locomotive was invented over in England. 65 years later, in 1869, in Utah, a golden spike completed America's first transcontinental train track, an entirely different sort of road. The U.S. was still a very young nation when its citizens began agitating the governments for a good east-west road. So in 1811, when Daniel was 77, work began on the national road between Cumberland, Maryland, and Vandalia, Illinois. Later on, new paths formed as Americans pushed farther west to Santa Fe and to the Oregon country. Long after Daniel's time, as folks began tooling around in cars, they hankered for roads such as the Lincoln Highway, built in 1914 from New York City to San Francisco, which is mostly US 30 these days. One of the most famous highways ever was born in 1926, US Route 66 from Chicago to Los Angeles. These roads and many an old trail eventually became part of the nation's interstate highway system, authorized by President Dwight D. Eisenhower on June 29, 1956. Up in southwestern Pennsylvania, for instance, cars and big trucks thunder along where George Washington, Daniel, and those redcoats plodded after stubborn General Braddock more than 2 centuries ago. Lives, even that of old Daniel, are short. Roads are long. The next highway you travel might well be someone's wilderness trail back there in America's living past. Imagine that, someone. Maybe it's restless Daniel Boone.